So, welcome everybody to the first of our speaker series for the 24-25 academic year. My name is Kenji Yoshino, and I'm the faculty director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. And it's a joy to be with all of you again for yet another speaker series cycle. I'm particularly delighted for this event to introduce our distinguished guest, Michelle Lamont. Professor Lamont is Professor of Sociology and African African-American Studies and the Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies at Harvard University. She's the author of numerous books, including The Dignity of Working Men, Morality and the Boundaries of Race, Class, and Immigration, How Professors Think Inside the Curious World of Academic Judgment, and most recently, as you see behind me, Seeing Others, How Recognition Works, and How It Can Heal a Divided World. She's also the author of several collective works and over 100 articles published in the American Sociological Review, American Journal of Sociology, Annual Review of Sociology, and other prominent outlets. Professor Lamont has also served as president of the American Sociological Association. We're thrilled that she has joined us here today. Toward the end of today's program, I'll open up for Q&A. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So first of all, Professor Lamont, welcome. It's such a delight to have you here at the center.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
So I'm going to jump right in with this superb book, which I think is a much needed tonic for our troubled and polarized times. So in the introduction to your book, you say that your research and experience as a sociologist has led you to a quote unquote inescapable conclusion that, quote, dignity affects quality of life just as much as material resources do, close quote. What do you mean by dignity, and why is it so important?
I define dignity not in terms of the intrinsic worth that someone has, but the messages that one receives that define someone as worthy. So it's a cultural process of validation by others, if you will. And it's partly important for well-being because through dignity, people have a sense of value that affects directly subjective well-being and physical health. So we know that this is the case because, for instance, if we think about the research of my colleague David Williams on the impact of discrimination on health, we see immediately that people who experience microaggression on a repeated basis have, not only a mental health problem, but also it affects various aspects of their physical health as well. For this aspect of my argument, I draw on a recent book by Stephen Etlin and Matt Anderson titled The Science of Dignity that goes through all the evidence about how important dignity is for people for well-being.
Fascinating. So many people across the political spectrum argue that dignity, recognition, and worth are much less important than material issues like poverty or economic inequality. I was actually interested in your answer that you sort of substantiated dignitary harm by moving to disparate health effects. The former issues, meaning the dignity, recognition, and worth issues, often get dismissed as quote unquote identity politics. So if dignity is so important, why do you think politicians, commentators, and activists so frequently dismiss or ignore it?
Well, often by identity politics, they're talking about sexuality, gender, race, that are code words for progressivism. But in fact, conservative politicians are talking about identity all the time. For instance, nationalism is certainly, making salient national identity. If you think about the MAGA movement, it's all about nationalism. So in fact, I think identity is inescapable when we think about the political choices that people make. And if you think about the social science literature, it's really grounded in very materialist assumption. If you think about the work of Marx, or even Weber has strong, materialist dimension. So I think it's you know, still fairly recent that a very systematic social science approach to identity has developed in psychology and sociology and political science. So in some ways, this is the golden age. And if you think, for instance, of class, you can think of class as economics, but in fact, class has a cultural dimension as well. Working class culture is a real thing. And it has a deep impact on politics. Like, for instance, I wrote a paper where, with some graduate students, we looked at the 73 presidential speeches, that electoral speeches that Trump delivered when he was running as president for the first time. And it was all about appealing to the working class by telling them that if they were facing challenges, it's not their fault because they're worthy people. It's the fault of globalization and the fault of immigrants. So that's an example of, how a right-wing politician is really mobilizing identity to recruit supporters.
Yes, one of the big ahas for me in reading Nancy Fraser was her distinction between the politics of redistribution and the politics of recognition. And she describes, redistribution as stuff and recognition as a kind of dignitary worth that you're describing. And I bristled a little bit when she said that class was a characteristic of, or Marxism was a paradigm example of the politics of redistribution, because I thought, well, there are lots of dignitary aspects to Marxism as well, right? So I take from your answer that that is also your view. But one of the reasons that sort of dignity, recognition, and worth may be ignored is that it just seems harder to address them through policy than material needs. So, in fact, that you argue in your book that, and here again I quote, political or institutional reforms will never be sufficient to produce the change we need unless we are also able to change our narratives, close quote. Could you explain what you mean by that? How can a society change its narrative?
Well, let's take one policy that was meant to address material need, food stamp. It's a case where low-income people were deeply stigmatized when they showed up at the grocery store with, their food stamp card. So in part because the dominant narrative about poverty in the US is to blame low-income people as opposed to, factoring in the structural dimensions that, foster poverty in our society. And a lot of NGOs have become far more aware of the importance of changing the narrative around poverty. So, for instance, the Gates Foundation has committed to a sizable amount of money to do exactly that by, doing experiments to see how can we encourage people to develop a more complex understanding of the factors that feed into poverty. The individualism that is really at the center of the American dream is feeding this. So for that reason, it's much harder for low-income people to be poor in the US than it is in Sweden or in other Scandinavian countries. So this shows you, again, that it's not only about economic, it's very much about the dominant narrative that surrounds us, that through which people experience their social position.
Yes, I can't resist quoting from one of my favorite legal scholars, Robert Cover, who says that all law is embedded in narrative. So I think he would fully agree with that. He says something like, for every decalogue, there is a scripture. For every constitution, there is an epic. So even our laws, can't be understood without the narratives in which they're embedded.
Very well put. And in the book, I mentioned how after the adoption of same-sex marriage, there was a rapid decline in LGBTQ youth in high school who attempted suicide. So, this is a very significant message that was sent to them, that you're worthy, you belong, you have access to one of the most sacred institutions of our society.
And you can imagine your way forward into a future too, right? So it's, yeah, I totally agree. So to get a little bit more specific, you critique the narrative of meritocracy and the narrative of grit or resilience. So I was really fascinated by this because these are words that we hear quite often, even internal to the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So even supporters of DEI sometimes argue that DEI helps create a better meritocracy, or argue that it's important for marginalized people to develop greater resilience in the face of barriers they experience at school or at work. So could you please help us find our way into your critique of these narratives and help us understand what we should replace narratives of grit or resilience with?
Well, the dominant approach to grit or resilience is Angela Duckworth, who is very much focused on grit as an individual characteristic, a little bit like a personality trait. I've co-authored with Peter Hall, a political scientist at Harvard and other social scientists, a book titled Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Era. And the point of that book is to see we need to build resilience, but at the societal level, in part by circulating narratives, such as the example I just gave about same-sex marriage, so that our environment is structured differently and give people the tools they need to be resilient. So it's a very, very different approach to moving away from the individualist focus. Concerning meritocracy, we live in a society that celebrates meritocracy every 2 seconds. But the problem with meritocracy is that it forgets that we don't live, there's no even playing ground here. My kids have 2 parents who have a PhD. They're born on an escalator, and that's not given for the vast majority of the population. So we need to think in terms of what are the resources that people have to play with. And I think another problem with meritocracy is it, consolidates the view that people who have a college degree, who are professionals and managers, people like us, are really the winners of the system. And it feeds the death by despair and all the problems that the working class has experienced with the growing inequality of the last several decades. So that's why I argue in the book that we really need to move away from this blind celebration of meritocracy. And we have to acknowledge, of course, that it's important to be very agentic. Being very agentic is a very important determinant of mental health. But at the same time, we have to also take into consideration the social position and the resources that people have at their disposal.
Yeah, I think that this question directly follows. So you point out that a person's sense of worth has a strong class dimension. So college-educated professionals tend to believe that their worth comes from education, expertise, and professional success. Working class individuals, on the other hand, obviously in the aggregate, tend to see their worth as tied to their contributions to their family, friends, and community. And you argue that a lack of validation and affirmation of working class people helps explain the appeal of right-wing populism. Could you help us connect the dots here? How does the need for recognition explain right-wing populism?
Well, it's a little bit the example I was giving earlier of Trump's electoral speeches in 2016, that he was very much defining himself as the defender of workers and reasserting their worth, at the same time pointing the finger at external factors that could explain why they have been struggling so much. That is, immigrants are coming in to take your job. And so the experience in the book, I talk also about a recent study of all stuff we see on television, which is constantly celebrating upper middle class people. The recent example would be like White Lotus. It's not only the upper middle class, it's the rich, eye candy for people who like beautiful settings and all that. The housewives of Beverly Hills, I could go on and on and on. And what it means is that the workers never see themselves represented. When they are represented, or very rarely, and when they are represented, it's often like losers, like Bart Simpson, You have recently the example of The Bear, which is interesting because it's a very much working class, show in Chicago, but the guy cooks, is a very sophisticated chef, so you have, again, working class job, but presented as a very, high culture kind of endeavor. So that's only one of the dimensions. The fact that the workers have had so many challenges with the growing inequality of the last decades. The literature tells us, well, they are very nostalgic about the past, but I'm now in the process of doing interviews with workers, young workers, 18 to 30, in Manchester, New Hampshire, and Manchester, UK. And what we find in Manchester, New Hampshire, among young people, 18 to 30, they're not nostalgic because their understanding of the past is really, really limited. You know, young people live in the present, even more so now with the social media. So it's not like the same as 60-year-old blue-collar worker who worked in the plants in Pittsburgh. You know, they don't have at all this view of what the working class used to be, like the backbone of America. For them, this is such a distant past. All they know is that it's really, really hard to pay their bills. And they wish that politicians would really have more of an idea of what people are up against. And the fact that so many, you know, upper middle class people live lives where the question is just, oh, where can I spend my money? You know, it's a totally different perspective on the world. And there's been such increase also in spatial segregation. So the middle and upper middle class has very few contact with the working class. So literally, we're increasingly living in very, very separate world. And for workers, most politicians seem to live in la la land, you know, and they feel very much not heard and not seen and not respected by most politicians. So one thing that Trump does very well is that with his sexist humor and him making fun of disabled people and him, you know, I mean, he's so anti, you know, he does not respect any rule of you know, inclusion, which in some ways, there's a very good book by a guy named Reese Peck called Fox Populism. And his argument is that where Trump really connects with the working classes at the level of humor and habitus, and that Fox News very much, you know, created this marriage between him and the working class that, you know, is carried by other of the, you know, main figures at Fox News. So it's a concept called habitus, which is captured through this notion of humor. And so that's where the Democrats are in some ways having a huge challenge. But I know you have questions for me about politics, but I think that Kamala Harris, with her joy and her dancing and her, you know, like she's really gone out of her way to really try to bridge that gap much more. And also to talk more about the needs of working class families, you know, and yeah, I could go on and on.
Oh, I'm actually going to invite you a little bit more since we are so close to the election and you were, you know, I think putting your finger on something so adroitly with regard to right-wing populism and speaking right to these issues of class. So if I am an opponent of right-wing populism, but I nonetheless want to engage in validation and affirmation, as you recommend, without coming across as pandering. How would I do that? You know, we hear over and over again that DEI is just the discourse of elites. So how would I actually be able to do that and be both be and seem authentic? And perhaps more importantly, what should Kamala Harris be saying and doing other than the TikToks and the dancing to bolster the dignity of the working class voter?
Well, just this morning, I read the report. I think it was in the New York Times. There's an organization that does research on how to appeal to workers in the context of the election. Bhaskar Shankura of Jacobin and the Nation is part of the board. And their takeaway is she should absolutely stop dumping on Trump because for workers, this is just more, it's very difficult to know for them what's the truth. So there's, you know, conspiracy theories leads them to think that when the candidates are trashing each other, it's just more disinformation. But the solution for her is really to talk in a very concrete way about the challenges that workers are facing and how she's going to be alleviating them. So, you know, a policy about subsidizing home buying and you know, to be as concrete as possible. And in terms of the language, I was so struck after Welsh was chosen as her as her VP, potential VP, that in his speech of, you know, at the convention, the Democratic convention, he said something like, to want children to be able to go to school without being scared of getting shot is just common sense. And I felt that's the guy we need, because depolitizing common sense and say, what do we need to just have a good, normal quality of life? You know, what's the problem? I respect, you know, the First Amendment as much as anyone else, but on the other hand, that's my limit. Kids should be able to go to school without being endangered. So I think claiming common sense and the middle ground is very, very much depoliticized in some ways, and pushing that, I think, can be quite effective. So I was thrilled when she chose him as a co-runner. Although, of course, he comes with some problems, but
I was told just yesterday that it was a wise choice not to go with Josh Stein because Josh Stein talks like a constitutional law professor. So I was trying not to take umbrage at that, Michelle, as one of those people myself.
yes.
So I want to shift to a different kind of divide. You devote a whole chapter to Generation Z and the unique challenges confronted by that cohort. How does your research on recognition specifically apply to Gen Z? And what can older generations do to ensure that younger generations have a dignified future?
Yeah, I should say I have 3 Gen Zs, which is partly what inspired the book. So that part of the book, basically what I do is, actually, I didn't do the interviews myself. I had, because, you know, Gen Zs don't want to talk to boomers. So it would not have created very good interviews. Well, I had 2 graduate students do these interviews, and we asked them, you know, these interviews were conducted just before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And we asked them, what are the main challenges that you experience and what kind of society would you like to live in? And what was really, really clear from these interviews is they don't embrace the American dream as something that is realistic for them. You know, they were preceded by the millennials, who many of them entered the job market after the 2008 recession. Many of them still have not bought a house. You know, for them, the white picket fence is such a, so they have to come up with another collective, you know, dream. And, you know, because we know that hope, you know, being able to have hope is about projecting into the future a narrative that is about something that you can reach. So my analysis in this chapter is very much that the dream that they aspire is that of being able to live in a more inclusive society, and also to be able to live more authentically. So that means, you know, being able to be themselves and to have real relationship with others, not fake relationship. And I think at the other end of the spectrum, these commitments can translate into cancel culture. So they might have very, very little patience for people who don't understand where they stand. And also, they perceive the attack against woke culture, for instance, you know, the bathrooms or the non-binary pronouns. When those things are criticized, they become extremely defensive because they feel that they're not being heard. So what can you know, Gen X or boomers do in response to this? I think a lot of people have not fully understood how much for them staying with the program of upward mobility and the American dream just seemed totally absurd. We have to be aware also that with climate change, many of them don't know how long they're going to be alive. So having a life program where you plan, like, in 40 years, I'm going to be doing X and Y, seems totally absurd for them. Their temporal horizon is very different than it is for many of us. So I think better understanding where they come from is super important. And of course, there's books like the recent book by Dickman about gender differences among Gen Zs, where women are way more progressive than men. So also being aware that how the experience of the feminism, although they might not call themselves feminist, but I think something like, you know, their opposition to abortion and their desire to control their own body, like the impact of The Handmaid's Tale on that generation of young women has been enormous. And I think that progressivism really orients them in a very different direction than a lot of young men. So being more attuned to the gender difference, I think, is very important. The challenge of young men is much more complicated, I think, because they feel if they cannot see a possibility for them to have a successful career and they feel it's a dead end, they don't know what to turn toward, you know? So, and these interviews we're doing with 18 to 30-year workers in New Hampshire, we know that some queer youth certainly define themselves as very progressive, even if they're working class, and it comes from their identity. And that's true also of some religious young adults that we've interviewed. But then many of them are, really standing back and away from politics because they think it's a huge mess, and there's so much anger and there's so much denigration of others that they just don't want to have anything to do with it. So it's really different paths toward politics that we find during that in that group. And we know that Trump is courting these young men with a lot of young working class men, with his obsession with MMX, and there's so many, again, convergence in the habitus there, and dislike of anything PC that he shares with some of that generation. So it's a complex picture.
Yeah, well, I first want to correct myself, and my wonderful fact checker here has said that I said Josh Stein when I meant Josh Shapiro. So thank you for that real-time fact check. I apologize for the error. I now want to go to that complexity that you just described, because one of the beautiful things about your book is its capacity to toggle between the immensely particular and the immensely universal. So even in this conversation, you've talked about the plight of the working class man in Manchester who doesn't see a future, his queer colleague in the same city who is, voting from his values, the young woman who is thinking about The Handmaid's Tale as a terrifying dystopian future for herself, climate change foreshortening the lifespan and projects of individuals of younger generations. So there's a particularity to all of those narratives. On the other hand, one of the things that really rises gradually out of your analysis in this book is sort of the importance of uniting around what we have in common, right, and our universal humanity. So how do we strike the right balance between the particular and the universal, and on carrying forth this dignitary project of seeing each other more clearly? And does your concept of ordinary universalism, which for those of you who are following along the book, it's page 144, does that help us here?
Well, I want to preface my answer by saying that I started thinking about this concept when in the early 1990s, I was doing interviews for the book, The Dignity of Working Man, which is based on interviews with white and Black workers in New York and white and North African workers in Paris. So for that book, I interviewed 30 North African workers. Many of them were illiterate. And, they've always been imported to France as guest workers to take jobs that were often unskilled jobs. So I remember conducting interviews. Actually, I wrote a paper with one of your colleagues, Anne Morning, in sociology, who's now a dean, I think, in social science. She was my student when she was young. She was amazing already. But we have this paper explaining how they think about ordinary universalism. So in those interviews, I asked them, what do you think are the differences between you and French people? And they constantly came back to ordinary universalism, saying, for instance, we're all children of God. We all have to get up in the morning and go to the bakery to buy our bread. I thought that was a very French example. We all have, we'd all spend 9 months in our mother's womb. We all have 10 fingers. We're all they use a lot of metaphor, like we're all insignificant, like clouds floating in the cosmos, very poetic analogies. And, this theme of we're all human was also very, very central in this book when I talk with white workers in the US, where, being in, I argue in the book that the African-American workers I interviewed were very much about the caring self. They also embrace the disciplined self, like paying your bills, not being a sponge, being self-relevant, which were so self-reliant, rather, which were so important for white workers. But this question of empathy and understanding the tragedy of you being human is something that was very, very salient in these interviews. And again, in the interviews with the Gen Zs too, you know, so thinking not, one of the criticism about any notion of universalism, for instance, when it comes to Muslim, is to say, once you defend human rights, it's a form of particular universalism. In the Muslim world, many people think, oh, this is just Western propaganda, you know, it's not China, etc., you know. So you don't want to promote a universalism in a blind way. When you talk about ordinary universalism, which is what all human beings have in common, then it's really, it opens also, one of the criticism that the book develops is meritocracy is, or, you know, the notion that we should be valued based on our socioeconomic success or degrees. It's a unidimensional hierarchy. And to create a more inclusive society, we need to move toward a plurality of views concerning what defines a worthy person. And if you can do this, then you can say, okay, some of us, you know, may be expert, we are expert, but we're also carers, and we're spiritual leaders, and, you know, there's so many different things that people can bring to contribute to society. So this notion of ordinary universalism is also grounded in a notion of, we live in the big umbrella where let 100,000 flower bloom, and, you know, it's not a zero-sum game.
And to call back, I take it that's why you give your imprimatur to Waltz's statement of common sense dictates that our children be able to go to school safely, because that seems like a ordinary universalism move.
Exactly. This is not a divisive statement, right?
So another difficulty in our world of advancing DEI and inclusion is overcoming zero-sum thinking. So you note that for some people, extending recognition and dignity to another group necessarily means losing some of their own. How do we convince skeptics that extending greater dignity and recognition to certain groups does not mean reducing the status of their own group?
Yeah, that is a very complicated one, because a lot of the explanations of the growing popularity of right-wing populism has been racial resentment, white people feeling that, you know, Black people are jumping the queue. Or I was just listening to an interview with a young Latina in Manchester that one of my research assistant had conducted, and she was very upset because she said that under Biden, Haitians and other newcomers could get you know, legal status in the US, whereas her mother, who was from El Salvador, had to wait for 20 years. So she's very, very upset about this, which is why she's gonna, you know, vote for Trump, although of course he's constantly trashing you know, Central American immigrants. So this is a very complicated one. Part of me feels like, you know, it's a little bit like, okay, if you think about economic resources, it is zero sum. You know, you have a cake and you have to divide it, and there's only so many pieces that are to be shared. But dignity is not a finite quantity. You know, many different kinds of people can be defined as valuable at the same time. Where it gets complicated is when, for instance, policymakers have to decide who's going to get what, and they create picking orders. So I recently published a paper on the rural-urban divide in Europe across the EU. It's a paper I co-authored with people who are the leaders of the quality of life survey that the EU conducts every year. And we show that across all EU countries, the divide between the urban and the rural population is growing, in part because those people, the rural people, think that the government, the EU, is constantly passing laws that disadvantages them and favors, you know, urban people. Think about subsidies to electric vehicles that are so expensive, only the upper middle class can buy them. So why subsidize that? Or, you know, the reimbursement for, you know, the pardon for student loan would be another example. So in principle, dignity is for all, but once it is tied and associated with different capacity to access resources, that's where the fight begins. And resources are zero sum. So on the other hand, that there's a lot that can be done in terms of fostering more inclusive perspective by, I like the analogy that I like is when you have three kids, it's one kid's birthday and he's upset because he's not getting any present and his sister is getting them. You can say, well, in 3 months, it's your birthday, So in other words, bringing in the dimension of time and, different priorities at different time makes things much more acceptable. And after all, if you think of the Scandinavian societies, it's very, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm spending several months now in the Netherlands, and I'm so struck by how they do society differently. I'll give you one example. The first meeting of the center where I am, it's a research center, they told us our shared values here is commitment. We're all committed here to creating a strong research community and being there for each other, which is a form of organizational messaging that I've rarely experienced in the American context. Don't want to be trashing the US because I'm Canadian, but it's a very, very different way of framing how we live together. And this focus on commitment to the community is really a recurring one in the Dutch context. So
I'd like to push a little bit on that idea of zero-sumness, because when I asked, how do we persuade people that dignity is not zero-sum, you sort of answered by tying dignity to material resources. But I'm wondering, and I understand if there's $100, right? If somebody gets it, somebody else doesn't get that dollar, right? So this is what John Roberts says about admissions to Harvard, right? If somebody gets in, somebody else doesn't get in, so it is inherently zero-sum. With regard to pure dignity, pure recognition, it doesn't seem like that would have to be zero-sum.
absolutely, and I totally agree with you. And we've moved from a world where, LGBTQ people were totally marginalized and stigmatized morally, and this has been changed, in a very significant way. So there's a chapter of the book that is precisely about the process by which groups that have been historically stigmatized have experienced this change and what make it possible. And I give the example of the reversal of stigma toward people who have HIV/AIDS, which has been a fantastic, success with the case of obesity, which remains deeply stigmatized, although we have, body affirmation movement. You've had, performers such as Lizzo, many, the Dove company, like companies that are really branding body, diversity. So the point there is that in contrast to your colleague, you have a colleague who is Jonathan Haidt, who is pushing this notion of tribalism. And my argument in this book is very much against tribalism, because there's an approach in psychology that says it's inherent in us as our human nature that we like people who are like us and we dislike people who are not. And to this, I oppose a notion of groupness, which is really that group can have more or less a strong sense of identity and be more or less exclusive. And this is something that we can affect through the narratives that are diffused in our environment. If you raise a family where you pit the kids against each other, as opposed to fostering a notion of collectivity, where, you get your needs taken care of, it doesn't mean that, the other person cannot have a birthday this week because you're going to have yours in 9 months from now. So this is where the cultural framing really makes a huge difference, I think. So the book is a very, very hopeful book. And I should have mentioned a lot of the data. There's 185 interviews with agents of change, which include stand-up comics and Hollywood producers, many people who produce discourse, narratives through entertainments and other means. And for instance, the question of meritocracy that we discussed earlier, we have one paper with the stand-up comics and the Hollywood creative where we show that they really embrace meritocracy, but they believe that meritocracy will not really be realized until we have multicultural meritocracy that can compensate for the injustice and discrimination that marginalized group have experienced over time. So it's an approach to meritocracy that takes into consideration the conditions in which people live. So I find that very interesting.
Fantastic. I have a couple more questions, but I want to invite the audience to enter their questions in the Q&A. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we have a very precious resource in Professor Lamont. So I hope that you will um, uh, field your questions as you see fit. So most of the people in our audience today are embedded within large institutions. So they're students or employees at NYU, or they work in major corporations, law firms, or other or nonprofit or educational organizations. So what should organizational leaders be doing to advance recognition and dignity within their own institutions? Like, what is something I could do this week to enhance the dignity of the folks at NYU Law?
Well, I think it's possible to do a kind of recognition audit, like ask yourself, who are the people who always are the first to speak in group meetings? Who are the ones who are never heard? Who have the office next to the restroom? Who have offices that are centrally located? So just in terms of the physical, I co-authored a paper in the Harvard Business Review that's precisely about the question of engineering, who is not heard, who's heard too much, and how to set up the office space in a way that it's more inclusive. There's also policies. So I have colleagues at Harvard, Lisa Berkman and Erin Kelly at MIT, who wrote a wonderful study of healthcare assistants. So people are pretty not very well paid, but they got the employers to be much more flexible in terms of them having time to bring their kids to the doctor or take care of their elderly mother. And it translated into much more loyalty toward the employer and much more willingness to, and much less absenteeism. So the point is, by treating your workers not only as producers and employees, but also as caregiver, you tell them you are seen. I understand that you're a human being. You have a life, and I honor that. And I'm there with you as your partner to try to help you create a good life, which has a lot of positive outcomes. So, my partner is Frank Dobbin, a sociologist who wrote a book titled Getting to Diversity. And one of his key findings is, diversity training are useless. Forget about this. But one thing that really works is mentoring, especially when mentoring is being put in the hands of everyone, including white middle-level managers. So it becomes everyone's business, and people get evaluated on the basis of this. But also, the role of the mentoring is to not only promote the people who are going to become partners, but to really make everyone feel like they are included in the process. So the process of distributing recognition more broadly is a sound strategy, if you will. And honoring them not only as workers, but also as human beings.
Fantastic. So we invited you to be our first speaker this year, in part by design, because we knew that we were going to be having frayed nerves in the run up to a hotly contested and polarized election. So it's easy to write off people who are different from us, in such an environment. In fact, taking steps to empathize or reach out across the aisle to recognize the dignity of our opponents can at times seem like collaborating with evil. So what would you say to someone who thinks that it's more important to fight the enemy than to build bridges across difference?
Well, I received recently in my inbox a new map of the American electorate, which is taking into consideration how many people are either undecided, independent, and different. And we find that, in fact, the American population is far less polarized than we are told all the time by the media. I mean, all the polls are about people who have taken position. So, and I think the social media are really pushing us in this direction. So my first step is to try to relativize this notion that we're so deeply polarized. If you take as a basis social media, we know that the people who express themselves most on the social media are also the people who are more at the extreme of the. So really, I think to combat this by representing accurately the distribution of opinions in the US would be a really good first step. On the less positive side, I remember giving a talk where there was an African-American who said, oh, no way will I ever want to extend humanity to racist people because they're not doing it for me. So this is for me an absolute no-go. So I totally understand where people come from, but at the same time, at the more collective level, I think we can do a lot to foster a bit more. I'm not a big person when it comes to promoting just, oh, just be a nice person, I don't think this is, but the solution I propose in the book is really to help with the circulation of narratives that are fostering more plurality in how we define who's worthy. So there's a lot of organizations now and a lot of social scientists who are trying to figure out what kind of messaging can help us move toward a less polarized society. But it's a huge challenge because it's happening not only in the US, but also throughout advanced industrial societies, right? So it's the emergence of the populist politicians who are also there as ideologues and celebrities who are cultivating cult of the personality is just extremely disheartening. And I wish I had more concrete solutions at that level. Do you have any opinions on this?
No, I do think that we all have to make this decision of what Melissa Harris Perry calls when to empathize and when to smite. I think that the lines can often be very fine-grained. So, as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, as a constitutional law professor, I argued a lot for same-sex marriage, right, prior to 2015, and would very much try to empathize with people on the other side and say, you have your views are often religiously motivated, and this is about whether you can live your faith in the public sphere, and really tried to make all of those gestures both authentically and on the stage publicly when I was debating folks. And oftentimes their reaction would be, you seem like a really nice person. You're different from other LGBT activists. So let's go out to dinner and break bread together. And I would draw a line there and I would say, like, I cannot do that because you basically don't believe that my marriage is a marriage, right? So I think that we can actually thread the needle, and it's oftentimes not a choice in the Manichaean sense of either I do this or I do not this. It's sometimes, you draw the lines in the middle in the messy way in which we all live our lives, attempting to live them in a principled way.
Exactly. Yeah, and the whole literature on deliberative democracy is very helpful. I know that at Harvard, Rakesh Khurana, the dean of the college, spent an enormous amount of time and effort to cultivate a more deliberative culture among our graduate students and undergrads. And it has worked quite well, to teach them, well, part of what becoming an educated person means is to be able to dialogue across the aisle and really try to understand where people come from, try to put yourself in their shoes and understand the inner logic of their position. So when for the Dignity of Working Man, I interviewed a lot of racist people, and also very sexist people who were chastising me for being a professor, saying, who's going to raise your children? My goal was really to try to understand why it made sense for them to be racist. And I remember the key argument of the book is they draw a lot of boundaries. They think of themselves as survivors who pay their bills, keep their kids out of trouble, are self-reliant, not sponging against the system. And then I ask them, what kind of people do you dislike? I dislike people who don't do all of this, especially it tends to be Black people in the inner city. So they would move from drawing moral boundaries to more drawing racial and class boundaries at the same time. So it becomes a kind of bundle. And you see this, in different configurations. So here in the Netherlands, it's a country that is very pro-LGBTQI, right? Extremely so, but there's very, very strong boundaries against Muslims. The right-wing populists are building their position against Muslim and they say, well, Muslims are anti-human rights. So this is a very different kind of bundling, but it's similar because it's also based on, moral boundaries. But in this case, it's directed to Muslim and not as much to racial minorities. So.
Right.
And the same thing is true in France. So, it's like understanding how these things work and moving, like pointing to this moral blaming is, I think, as a social scientist, that's the kind of thing I can do to help people understand how it works. But of course, this is just a drop in the bucket, because being able to, and that's the argument of the book, all of us agents of change, cultural producers, we create new narrative, but the narratives need to be scaled up. So the book points to the role of philanthropies such as the Ford Foundation that has, for instance, subsidized the film Roma. And Roma went to win an Oscar, and it was broadly diffused on Netflix and elsewhere. And what it does is offer us a very close look at the life of domestic workers in Mexico City. And one of them is trying to decide whether or not to get an abortion. So when I talked to people involved in the production of this film, they said, yes, it was all about humanizing them and making the domestic workers be viewed as three-dimensional people, as opposed to stereotypically, typically maids are always, blurred in the background. When in this film, it's the middle-class family that is blurred in the background, and the camera is just, but this was a very important film, not only because it won an Oscar, but also because it was one of several other films that were promoted by Ford and other organization. There's an organization called the Alliance for Domestic Workers, headed by Agent Poo, and what they do is precisely focus on destigmatizing, domestic workers. So it's an example of scaling up narratives, which is where this change happened, and that's what my book is about, as opposed to simply emphasizing empathy. We should all do yoga and meditation and try to become more empathic. I think structuring the cultural environment in which we live differently is something that is actually achievable. And just to give you one more example, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has a huge program called The Culture of Health, and it's very much also about diffusing narratives that help with inclusion. So that's the kind of alliances that you see between the philanthropic movement and the cultural producers.
I want to turn to audience questions now. And this is a beautiful one because it suggests what happens when you have scale, but you have a diminution in deliberation. So here's the question. What role do you think social media plays in identity and ultimately tribalism? Do you think it exacerbates these heightened tensions? What can be done to combat these elements in polarizing our society?
Yeah, well, I'm no expert in social media, but everyone I know who studies it says that it does so, in part because it's all about likes and dislikes, and it has this huge negative impact on mental health as well. This being said, I am on Twitter because I find it interesting. I learned a lot about what people publish. It remains very helpful. I'm also very critical of that research, especially the nudging research, because it takes people really out of context, and we're not Pavlovian dogs, It's all about, treating social media as nudges, but we operate in much broader contact where we have significant others, we have friends, we have family members who are influencing us at least as much as the social media do. So I think there's a lot of hype, frankly, and we know that in terms of posting, it's a very small number of people who are posting on the major social media. So we don't want to, most of the literature there focuses again on the two ends of the spectrum and are not looking at the vast majority of people who are standing back and, very skeptical about all these changes. So it's a little bit like what we call in social science sampling on the dependent variables. People are looking at the end of the spectrum and they say, oh, everyone is at the end of the spectrum. Yes, your research design is faulty. So it's a big problem in that field, I think.
I want to follow up with this. This next question follows up on something that you said earlier about the future for young men. I think this is your Tale of Two Cities project with the two Manchesters. So following up on the future for young men, how do we foster a sense of belonging or community when young men seem to feel alienated from work, partners, financial security, and see their future as bleak?
Oh, yeah, that is such a tough one. Recent studies of Andy Cherlin and Kathy Eden show that working class men are, because many of them feel they cannot be providers anymore, They have pulled themselves out of the associations, the world of associations that they used to belong, you know, the Knight of Columbus, the church, etc. So their social capital has really been depleted. And this, of course, has fed and is being fed by the literature on the, you know, death by despair and isolation, and the fact that men are not necessarily socialized to do as much emotional work. So Alcoholics Anonymous and many other organizations are really, you know, I think quite important in giving them, exposing them more to the therapeutic culture and getting them to learn to talk more about their feelings and stand out. But there's an organization called the Association for Black Men Achievement, which is all about reframing Black men as a source of potential rather than a source of problems. So there again, there's a lot of literature about, you know, how to address some part of this. I wish I had a better answer. I think to move away from a society that is so much defined by socioeconomic success is also a solution. Because if men think they have to be a providers and they don't see a path toward just doing this, it becomes very challenging to define other ways of being worthy. So they can be worthy by being there for others, by, you know, engaging in service organizations where they can give to others, away from the toxic masculinity that is just feeding so much mental health problems, I think, so, and violence. So,
I fear this is going to have to be our last question. It's been such an excellent conversation. And this last conversation is almost the flip side of the one that I just asked. So what if you make it, right? So this question says, you've spoken about recognition for working class people versus middle or upper middle class people. Can you speak a bit about marginalization you see among the subset of working class people who've attained middle or upper class status? For example, people who grew up working class and now work in elite setting. So this is kind of the privileged poor idea to come back to that one, but please.
That is a great question. At some point, I was asked to talk to one of the major, you know, management consultancy company at their very, very top level people, EY, actually, I'm going to name them. And they told me a lot of our top people are first gen. And we approach diversity by telling them you share a lot with people of color, with women, with LGBTQI as first gen, because you have been, you have entered into a corporate environment where you felt like outsiders. You didn't know the rules of the game, but, you know, a lot of those members of these other group have felt the same. So they've used the first gen label as a way to create solidarity across groups, and it seems to have worked fantastically. That's the approach that they're using. So I think to tell first gens that, yes, they share a lot of challenges with others. And actually the people who have not experienced any marginalization in their life at any level, like me, I'm a Harvard professor, but I grew up in a world that was quite sexist, you know? So I think many people have aspects of their identity that allows them to develop understanding with people who have experienced also exclusion or stigmatization on other bases. So that can also be a basis for creating solidarity and improving people's quality of life, I think.
Fantastic. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank you, Michelle, for this brilliant book and for the compassionate intellect that forged it. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's my pleasure, and a pleasure to meet you as well.
Fantastic. We're adjourned. Thank you, colleagues.